En 1995, Gabriel García Márquez creó en Cartagena la Fundación para el Nuevo Periodismo Iberoamericano. Tras 25 años impulsando el periodismo independiente, ético, innovador y riguroso, ahora somos Fundación Gabo. Somos taller de periodismo. Formamos, inspiramos, incentivamos y conectamos a periodistas de toda Iberoamérica. Somos Premio Gabo. Premiamos el mejor periodismo en español y portugués. Somos Festival Gabo. Celebramos en Medellín el poder de las historias en la mayor fiesta del periodismo y la curiosidad. Somos Centro Gabo. A partir del legado de Gabo, promovemos proyectos de desarrollo social, cultural y educativo. Somos Fundación Gabo. Con camaradería y chéveridad desde el Caribe colombiano, promovemos un mejor periodismo, la creatividad y la memoria de nuestro fundador.
Al proteger al jaguar, apoyamos a que los bosques se mantengan vivos, las especies subsistan y el agua siga corriendo por el continente. Él solo existe si el ecosistema está saludable. En Conexión Jaguar, protegemos, recuperamos y conectamos los hábitats naturales del jaguar en Latinoamérica a través del apoyo a proyectos de conservación y restauración de bosques. Con los proyectos apoyados, mitigamos los efectos del cambio climático al preservar los bosques, que son grandes almacenadores de carbono. Innovamos para que la conservación en manos de las comunidades sea rentable y autosostenible. Al brindar apoyo técnico y económico, para que iniciativas forestales en Latinoamérica comercialicen créditos de carbono de alta calidad para financiar la conservación en el corredor del jaguar. Contribuimos a la protección y mejoramiento de los servicios que nos brinda la naturaleza, la protección de la biodiversidad, la mitigación del cambio climático. Además, apoyamos al empoderamiento y desarrollo de las comunidades rurales. Nos sumamos a las metas globales de sostenibilidad, apoyando al cumplimiento de convenios internacionales y ayudando a la reducción del impacto del cambio climático. Para cambiar el futuro del planeta, necesitamos pasar de los diagnósticos a las acciones. Haz parte de Conexión Jaguar. Apoya proyectos de conservación y restauración de bosques o compensa tu huella de carbono con nosotros para que juntos dejemos un legado a las futuras generaciones. Si hay conexión, hay vida.
The Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism and education organization that funds reporting that otherwise wouldn't get covered. We take the work in those projects, use it in our educational engagements to extend the life of the reporting and promote as much conversation as we can.
It is vital to tell underreported stories because we live in a world that's much bigger than us.
Hello, everyone. It's a huge honor to be here moderating the panel Investigating Power in Environmental Crisis. This is the third seminar in a series of 4 webinars promoted by Gabo, by the Pulitzer Center, and by Grupo ISA program Conexión Jaguar. My name is Patricia Campos Mello. I am a journalist from Brazil. And today we're going to learn from 3 amazing journalists what are the challenges they are facing or have faced while reporting about environmental issues, and what are their recommendations to other journalists who might be watching us, so that we can do these kinds of stories, challenging stories. During our panel, our speakers will be speaking English and Spanish. So in case you need translation, you can access our simultaneous translation service by following the directions in the video's description box. Durante el seminario habrá panelistas presentando en inglés y en español. En caso de necesitar traducción, por favor, siga las instrucciones que aparecen en la casilla de descripción de este en vivo. So to start, I would like to introduce Amy Martin. She's a journalist from the United States. She's the founder and executive producer at Threshold, a Peabody Award-winning public radio show and podcast that tackles one pressing environmental issue each season. So Amy is going to show us a presentation about her work and her latest stories. Amy?
Thank you so much, Patricia, and thank you to everyone who's with us here today. It's an honor to be part of this event. We can go ahead and start the presentation. So as mentioned, I'm the founder and executive producer of this podcast called Threshold. And in relation to the question about power and environmental crises, what I wanted to focus on today was one story, and we can hold right here on this slide. I wanted to tell the story of reporting in the village of Shishmaref, Alaska, which is a small indigenous village on the coast of Alaska, which is suffering the dramatic effects of climate change in the north. Because of the loss of sea ice and because of melting permafrost, this small island that the village of Shishmaref is on is being eroded away. Both the land is sinking because of loss of permafrost, and the lack of sea ice does not protect the island anymore from violent winter storms. And so the coastline is being eroded away. But in terms of power in this crisis, where my mind went when I was thinking about this is all of the nesting boxes of power and how they all interrelate and affected me as a journalist in trying to tell this story. There is the power struggles within the United States government about different ways to handle environmental crises, or even definitions of whether or not we are having environmental crises. There's the power between Alaska and Washington, which is, there's a lot of tension there between the state and the federal government. There's the power between the colonial settler culture, the white dominant culture, and indigenous people in the area. And then there's the power dynamics of being a journalist coming into an area to try to tell a story which I am not living myself. And especially as a white journalist coming into an indigenous community. So I'm going to try to briefly touch on all these different layers as they intersect, and hopefully that will be of some interest to all of you. We can go on ahead to the next slide. So one of the things I just wanted to say to kind of set the scene is that the story of Shishmaref and other small villages along coastal Alaska has been told in different ways, actually for quite a long time, as this coastal erosion process was becoming more well known. And here's a headline from the New York Times from 2007. And I just wanted to call attention to the fact that the use of the word victim of climate change. This is actually a different village that the New York Times is reporting on, but we can go ahead to the next slide. And you'll see that, again, in another iteration of a story, this was a documentary film and a book called The Last Days of Shishmaref in 2008. Shishmaref is still there. It's to say that it was its last days in 2008 is potentially problematic. And also, again, it was billed as a documentary about the first victims of global warming. And I was very aware when I went there in 2017 that this had been a kind of a constant theme in the reporting of this area. And it opens up some interesting questions about power, because this community is definitely suffering because of climate change. But to label a community and a group of people victims, I think, is a very loaded term, and it was something I was trying to be aware of and stay away from, honestly. So let's go ahead and look at the next slide. This is what it looks like in Shishmaref, where it looked like when my colleague Nick Mott and I were there in 2017. And you can see the houses and buildings are right next to this seawall, which has been built to try to protect the village. 50 years ago, those buildings that we're seeing were probably half a kilometer, if not more, away from the coast. And so this village is just getting eaten. And it's really, really dangerous. Really at any point, especially in the fall and winter, storms could come in and wash over this village, and there would likely be loss of life. And it could be really terrifying for this community. So I just want to make sure that as we're thinking about this, that we're aware that this is a true environmental crisis, but like so many environmental crises, it's playing out incrementally, bit by bit, year by year. And it's been hard, therefore, to get the appropriate attention to it. Let's go ahead and look at the next slide. So in July of 2017, actually, this was just a month before I went to Shishmaref, there was a scientist who was working within the Interior Department in Washington, D.C., named Joel Clements, who blew the whistle on the Trump administration because he had been working for a long time trying to call attention to this coastal erosion issue. And under the Obama administration, there had been a panel, a consortium of indigenous leaders that were brought together, and they created their own agenda for ways that they wanted to relocate and solve this problem as a group among many different villages. And there was a lot of progress being made toward funneling some funds and some technical support to the villages, but led with indigenous people at the forefront. And under the Trump administration, that whole project got obliterated, defunded, and shut down. And this scientist tried to blow the whistle to say that this was actually an extremely dangerous and wrong-headed thing to do. And when he tried to raise that point, he was reassigned to a completely different job in the royalties collection department of the Department of the Interior. And so he left and tried to blow the whistle to say that the power structures in place were not paying attention to the life threat that was really at work here. So let's go ahead and look at the next slide. With all of that in mind, when I showed up in Shishmaref, this was my experience. It was an incredibly friendly place. There were lots of children who live in Shishmaref. We actually gave our cameras to some of the kids for a day, and they ran around taking pictures of each other. And this is a portrait that one boy in Shishmaref took of another, which I just love for so many reasons. And let's go ahead and look at the next slide. I felt like what I wanted to try to do in a way to puncture through all of these layers of power and disempowerment and misuses of power was just as much as possible to just center the voices of people who live in Shishmaref. This is a woman named Nora Kazugak. I spent most of the day with her. She told me her story growing up on the island and remembering what it was like to visit people in sod houses, and just some amazing stories of what it means to be an Inupiaq person living in this community. Next slide, please. This is a local teacher and a local engineer who are making a life together in the village, who have lots of ideas of how to help the community grow and potentially move to a safer location. Next slide. I just want to show you a few different faces from the village. This is a father and son who we spent part of an afternoon with, who the father owned a store on Shishmaref, and the son, Walter, kind of ended up being a little tour guide for me and taking me around and introducing me to other kids in the village. And let's look at the next slide too. And this was Nick, my colleague, went out for an afternoon with these two boys and just kind of picked berries with them and explored the island with them. And I guess I just wanted to show you some of these faces and raise the question of what we do as journalists in this situation and how to think about it, because we were there for a week. We're two white journalists in an indigenous community. We did write and ask for permission to visit as a way to try to not burden the community too much. They've actually had a lot of visits from journalists. But in the course of researching this and talking about this, like I said, I was just very aware that they had been cast as victims, as climate refugees, and other labels. And it's not that some of those things don't apply at all, but I wasn't hearing people themselves use those words. I was hearing outside journalists apply those words to them. And that was one of the things that I think was really important about being there and trying as much as I could to listen for how people told their own stories, listen for the words they chose. And, you know, the words that people were using were, we're strong, we're resilient, we've lived through all kinds of changes in the past, we're tough, we're survivors. And they are very worried, and they are very frightened by the ways that this situation has left them vulnerable, but they're also by no means calling themselves victims. Let's go ahead and look at the next slide. I think I need to wrap up here pretty soon, but I guess I would just close by saying, well, this is Winfred Obrook. He also grew up on Shishmaref and lived there all his life, and he was part of the search and rescue team there. You know, one of the things that is not that it had never been told before we got there, but we definitely tried to highlight in our storytelling was that the whole reason that this community ever ended up located on this barrier island that is being eroded because of climate change was itself part of the colonization story. This community, this group of people were semi-nomadic, and they moved around with the seasons. And the only reason why they were forced to build, you know, houses that could not be moved and keep their community in one place was because of the colonization process, both in terms of religion, education, government. And so the process that disempowered them and pulled them away from their traditions is also the same process that now is making them vulnerable for as climate change is hitting them hard. And so I think that was one thing that I really tried to also show, and instead of just simply pasting the label of victim on them, understand that the many layers of injustice that had been suffered by this community, and the way that they are persisting and determined to stay together and stay strong as a community despite that. Let's look at the next slide. And I guess I just wanted to close again with just these faces of children, just to say that most people in Shishmaref, like I think most communities everywhere, are very, very focused on the future that they're trying to build for their children. And I think they find great strength and power in that. I'm not sure that as a white outside journalist that I actually left the village feeling very aware of the limitations that I bring as an outsider and as a person who's not from that culture. And I think ideally there would be a journalist, you know, from that community or a nearby community telling that story. And so maybe that's a good place to open up for a conversation of just the ways in which the power that I wield is something that, and as we wield as journalists, is something for us all to think about critically, I think, in situations like these. So I don't know, Patricia, if you wanted to have a back and forth, or. Oh, I'm sorry, I can't hear what's going on.
Sorry, I was on mute. Sorry. This is our life now, our Zoom life. No, I was going to say, thank you so much for your presentation. This is so interesting. Also, the fact that you chose to give them the main voices of the story, let them tell how they feel, which is something we don't usually see. I think we're going to go ahead with the other presentations, Amy, and then we're going to ask questions, and then we're going to ask questions from the audience. So now I would like to present Wahyu Dhyatmyka, and he's going to correct my pronunciation after that. He's a journalist from Indonesia. He's an investigative journalist and editor-in-chief at tempo.co and member of the Global Environmental Reporting Collective. And he's been doing all kinds of investigative journalism and environmental investigative journalism. So Wahyu, thank you so much for participating in the panel. I think you're going to make a presentation of your latest reporting. Not sure if you can hear me. Wahyu? Is he there? He's back.
I'm back.
Is internet not so good there, right?
Yeah, unfortunately.
Okay, so Wahyu, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Patricia. It's really an honor to be invited to share the panel with such a distinguished from all over the world. This is my first opportunity to speak at this this event, and I think I'm feel privileged to share these stories with you all. I'm going to share two stories. It's a year-long investigation that Tempo did with several other media. Can we go to the first slide, please? But before that, let me just tell you my tips when we face with a lot of environmental crisis around us. Sometimes we feel hopeless. Sometimes we feel that whatever we do, sometimes it has no impact. It cannot change the situation, and we don't know where to start. To expose all of this crisis and destruction, and not to mention the people or the power behind it. And whenever I find myself in that kind of difficulties, I will talk to my colleagues at civil society organization, environmental activists, because sometimes they have a hint on where to start. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, these are the two projects that I would like to share. The first one is about pangolin. Pangolin is the smallest mammal in the world, but unfortunately they are near extinction because they have been poached and trafficked from Asia and Africa, mostly to China. Because in China, their scales, meats, all part of their bodies are used mostly for traditional medicine. The second story is about forest fire. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this kind of crisis. It also happened in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia. And I will share stories about how we trace and expose corporations behind forest fire. As Patricia said earlier, I will try to share the challenges and the obstacles instead of only the outcome, and also tips on how we overcome those challenges, and hopefully we can discuss much more afterwards. Next slide, please. So the first story is about pangolins. This is an investigation that I did with Environmental Reporting Collective. It's a collaboration of more than 40 journalists from Southeast Asia, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Nigeria, and Cameroon in Africa. All of us started with the same question, because we heard a lot of cases about scales, pangolin meats, even live pangolins trafficked to China. But we don't know whether this network of smugglers are connected to each other. Why are they keep sending all of this animal to China? How much money did they get from this illegal activity? Do they know that these pangolins are very vital to the ecosystem in the forest because they eat ants and they work the land when they hunt for their food, and that keep the soil fertile. And with their numbers diminishing in the wildlife, it affect the whole ecosystem. So we want to know those questions. We want to know who are behind this big push to traffic pangolins. Next slide, please. So we end up working together, 40 of us. We did the part in our own country, starting from the supplier country, Indonesia and Malaysia in Southeast Asia, and also Africa. There's 4 types of pangolins all over the world, but mostly the one that get trafficked to China are the one who live in forest area in Sumatra and Borneo in Indonesia and Malaysia. So we first started with the poachers. What are the incentive for the poachers? Where do they send the pangolins? How do they get information about demand from China? Who are the middlemen? And so on and so forth. Then after we finished tracing the network, we hand it over to the colleagues in the next country. So for instance, in Indonesia, once we know it was sent to Malaysia, we inform our colleague in Malaysia, and then they will take it over from there, try to, from our leads, then expand our leads, talk to people, talk to the sources, and confirm what we have found in the region. So that become a chain of reporting from Indonesia to Malaysia. In Malaysia, our colleagues there from the Star, the newspaper in Malaysia, then found that there are some law enforcement involved that send the pangolins to the border of Thailand. And we hand it over to our colleagues in Thailand and so on until we end up visiting the factories and the places where they keep all that traffic pangolins in mainland China. Next slide, please. So this is one of the network that we managed to expose in Indonesia. We have some information that really useful is the money trail. So we cooperate with the police because they were also investigating this illegal trafficking, and we get some inside informations about bank transfer, so money transfer inside the network of the smugglers. And we know then from this data that they get information about demand from their middleman in Malaysia. So this middleman got it from China. Then whenever there is a demand for a certain amount of pangolins, then they will inform their poachers network on the ground. This is a very important information for this investigation, because then knowing the money involved and how they get initial informations about demand from their end buyers are really important to stop the smuggling happening in the first place. Next slide, please. So this is the challenges Of course, getting or finding the beginning of the network is the first challenge. You want to map the smugglers, you want to map the network of these traffickers, but where do you start? So what we did was we collect all of the informations about failed smuggling or trafficking that has been exposed by the police, and use that as an initial information that in that area a network is operating. And with that case, we use that as the starting point, and using a snowball methods from one person to the other person that this person know, and then after that getting to the next chain in the network and so on and so forth, until we manage to create a full map of traffickers network in Asia and Africa. The second challenge is about getting the context and the story, the real story, because the data itself sometimes don't have enough information. So you need to know the context of each names, each actors in the network, and in doing so, then you will give a fuller picture to your audience about the real people, the real faces behind this previously unknown network of traffickers. Next slide, please. So this is the second story about forest fire. As you know, in Indonesia, we had a big investment of palm oil and industrial plantation for pulp. Because of this too big investment, sometimes they use and increase the concession area into protected forests. We have two big fires in our forest in 2015 and in 2019. Last year, the fire burned 1.65 million hectares of forest. And the damage to the environment was incalculable. Haze from the forest fire spread throughout the region to other countries in Singapore, in Malaysia, choking hundreds of thousands of people and damaging their health. So we start with that question: who are behind them? Next slide, please. So we did this with several methods. First, we get data about the concession area, and we try to compare the concession area of this plantation in the forest fire area before the fire and after the fire. So this is one example from 4 satellite images of a company called Bumi Mekar Hijau. It's a plantation company for pulp in Sumatra. We compare before the fire in September and after the fire in November. And you can see that after the fire, there have been activities to expand the plantation. So they use the burn area from the forest fire as a plantation ground. This is the first evidence that the corporation itself might have something to do with the fire, because they gain benefit, or they even use the forest happened in their concession area. Next slide, please. This is also the same methods that we use in Kalimantan for a palm oil companies. You can see on the left below pictures, there's hotspots, initial fire hotspots in the area. And on the right-hand side below, you can see that it started to grow plantation after the fire was gone. So we compare several satellite images. It shows some link, but of course we need to check it on the ground. Next slide. So after we have that initial data from the satellite images, we have to go to the ground and check the location ourselves. And that become another obstacle for this investigation, because first, getting the data itself is quite difficult. There are several versions of the concession area. So you need to make sure that the data in your hand is really the one that being used by the companies. The second big challenge is trying to get to the location, because sometimes it's really remote. It takes hours to get to the location from the nearest city, and sometimes it has very strict security protocol, and you cannot enter the location without the locals, villagers helping you to get there. But with good local contacts, with the support of local civil society, we managed to go to each location and tell the story. So there you have it, the two stories that we did in last year. The second story, the forest fire, was supported by Pulitzer Center. Thank you for Pulitzer Center for supporting that story. Gracias. Thank you so much.
Fascinating reporting, the way you're applying follow the money and criminal organizations investigations into environmental reporting. This is really, really interesting, and I'm sure we're going to have so many questions after that. But first, I would like to introduce María Ramírez. María Ramírez is a journalist from Venezuela. She works at El Correo del Caroní, and she's the co-author of Gold Mining Devastation Beneath the Ice of Roraima, Tepuy. It's a multimedia project developed with the help of the Pulitzer Center. So, Maria, thank you so much for being here. And if you want to start with your presentation.
Muchísimas gracias, Patricia, y muchísimas gracias a la Fundación Gabo y al Centro Pulitzer por esta invitación. Me siento muy contenta de que Venezuela esté siendo vista en este momento. Voy a empezar contándoles y mostrándoles cuál fue nuestro proyecto. Para eso voy a necesitar que, por favor, el equipo coloque la página web donde está el trabajo. Ok, acá está nuestro trabajo, fue publicado el 5 de junio de este año. Quisiera destacar que en esta zona de Venezuela, que es la zona de la Amazonía venezolana, tenemos muchos años investigando la explotación de minerales. Tenemos años también siguiendo lo que está pasando luego de la creación del Arco Minero del Orinoco, que es un megaproyecto estatal creado por el gobierno de Nicolás Maduro, pero hacía falta encender la luz sobre este problema con una mirada más integral. Veíamos que pues, la mayoría de las coberturas se quedaban solamente quizás en los monitoreos, pero había detrás de este hecho algunas historias que queríamos investigar. Y por eso entonces decidimos enfocarnos en una zona protegida del sur de Venezuela, que es considerada además un patrimonio mundial de la humanidad. Decidimos entonces ir a ese lugar, primero, por supuesto, hacer una planeación, porque es una zona remota, es una zona lejana, con muchas limitaciones de acceso. Además, mucho antes de ser un patrimonio y de ser un área protegida, es un territorio indígena, y debíamos entonces tener un plan que nos permitiera tener acceso a estas zonas. Formamos para esto también un equipo multidisciplinario. No solamente éramos un grupo de periodistas y fotógrafos, sino que nos aliamos con una organización no gubernamental llamada SOS Orinoco, y contamos también en nuestro equipo con científicos que nos ayudaron no solamente a hacer este monitoreo satelital inicial, sino también a hacer una evaluación en campo. Fuimos entonces en un primer viaje a requerir pues, los accesos que necesitábamos con las comunidades indígenas, porque como les comento, pues es un territorio indígena, y luego sí fuimos el equipo completo. Dividimos este trabajo en 6 partes y me gustaría, por favor, que fueran bajando el site. Dividimos este trabajo en 6 partes Y una de las cosas más importantes es que éramos el primer equipo que entraba a estas minas de esta zona protegida. Por lo tanto, pudimos no solamente visualizar lo que pues ya veíamos en ese monitoreo satelital de grandes minas y grandes huecos sin vegetación, sino también ver cómo las comunidades indígenas se interrelacionaban con esta actividad minera. En ese primer monitoreo satelital que hicimos, con una data que nos dio la ONG Soso Orinoco, que ya había monitoreado hasta 2018, nosotros hicimos una nueva revisión satelital y encontramos que 1.033 hectáreas de esta zona protegida están intervenidas por la minería. La idea entonces era ir a la zona y hablar con la gente, escuchar las historias, entender por qué era que las comunidades indígenas estaban no solamente permitiendo que se hiciera minería en su territorio, sino también estaban participando. Hicimos geolocalización, como pueden ver allí, con las minas más importantes, y entendimos entonces que este no es solamente pues un problema que implica grandes actores, sino que estas comunidades pues se han visto impulsadas a hacer minería por distintos factores, no solamente por la crisis económica que vive Venezuela, sino también por la caída del turismo y en general por la crisis humanitaria compleja que está atravesando el país. El trabajo refleja también cuáles son los poderes que están involucrados en esta actividad, no solamente pues las comunidades indígenas pues participando en la actividad, sino también grandes actores o actores medios como militares y también pues el gobierno, porque toda esta actividad minera se desarrolla con insumos que requieren necesariamente de la autorización de autoridades gubernamentales. Esas diferentes escalas del poder están reflejadas acá en el trabajo. Contamos también con testimonios de personas familiares de personas que han sido víctimas por accidentes laborales en estas minas. Reconstruimos sus historias porque también pues, entendemos que allí hay muchísimo valor. También quisimos hacer un apartado que mostrara entonces cuál era la afectación ambiental y fuimos pues muy afortunados de tener en el equipo entonces una bióloga que se encargó de hacer esas revisiones. Hay una parte de este trabajo que fue pues muy retador porque a pesar de que queríamos tener evidencias, conseguimos evidencias y hay una parte de este trabajo que está todavía en espera porque tuvimos que publicar por supuesto en medio de la pandemia y pues estamos esperando a poder continuar con algunos análisis que están pendientes. También queríamos ver cuáles eran las alternativas que habían en estas comunidades para que no solamente la minería fuera la primera opción y encontramos que hay alternativas y hay soluciones que pueden ser potenciadas como la piscicultura y esos proyectos también están reflejados en este trabajo. Encontramos también que una forma de investigar el poder es también revisar cuál es la situación de las organizaciones o de las instituciones que tienen como principal misión velar porque estas actividades no se den, velar porque estas sean realmente áreas protegidas, porque son muy ricas en biodiversidad. Y en ese sentido fuimos a la principal institución ambiental de la zona, recorrimos algunas de sus oficinas, hablamos con sus trabajadores y revisamos algunos documentos presupuestarios que nos indicaban pues cuál era la mínima inversión que realiza Venezuela en materia ambiental. Por lo menos esta institución trabaja con apenas 4% de lo que realmente necesita para operar. Realmente para nosotros, más allá de las cifras y de tener esta evidencia de cuál era la afectación en este momento, era muy importante escuchar las voces de las comunidades. Y eso me lleva entonces a mostrarles algunas de las claves que encontramos no solamente en este trabajo, sino pues en los últimos años de reportería sobre esta materia. Voy a compartir mi pantalla. Pueden verla. Algunas de las claves que, bueno, son lecciones porque estamos en constante aprendizaje es que para este tipo de trabajos requerimos una planeación robusta. Son viajes muy extensos, muy costosos y con muchas limitaciones en el caso de Venezuela. La construcción del equipo multidisciplinario y la posibilidad de tener evidencias era un punto, una clave esencial para nosotros. Luego mirar el entramado completo y acercarnos a estas zonas sin prejuicios. Entendemos que hay comunidades indígenas, pero tenemos que tener pues mente abierta para encontrarnos con cualquier posibilidad en el terreno. Tratar de investigar desde el pez más pequeño hasta el más grande. Normalmente nos concentramos quizás en los actores más conocidos, en las figuras que normalmente ocupan cargos más importantes, pero tenemos que entender que en este tipo de conflictos no hay lobos solitarios, hay una granja que tenemos que tratar de comprender y de visibilizar. La corrupción no se limita solamente al ámbito público, no tiene color político y es otra de las claves que tenemos que tener presentes en este tipo de investigaciones. También, por supuesto, tratar de detectar esquemas y buscar pruebas. Y en el caso de Venezuela, en donde tenemos escaso acceso a la información pública, en donde no tenemos data que nos permita monitorear este tipo de conflictos, ha sido muy útil acudir al periodismo colaborativo transfronterizo. He participado en diversos proyectos que me han permitido entender y nos han permitido aprender que si bien no tenemos los datos en el origen, que es en Venezuela, si bien no podemos quizás precisar cuáles son las toneladas de minerales, de oro, que parten de Venezuela, sí podemos comprender, encontrando cifras y estadísticas en otros países, y sí podemos entonces tener una idea de cuál es, por ejemplo, el contrabando de minerales, cuánto llega a otros países. También es de mucha ayuda revisar investigaciones de otros países, quizás en el cómo lo hicieron ellos podemos encontrar claves para aplicarlas en nuestros países. Entender el contexto es clave. Por ejemplo, en estas zonas de Venezuela es importante pensar cuánto pesa, por ejemplo, la crisis humanitaria en zonas tan remotas como el sur de Venezuela, sin otras alternativas económicas. Hay una complejidad detrás que debemos abordar y que definitivamente tiene que estar reflejada en el trabajo para que el lector pues, finalmente pueda tomar alguna conclusión. Además de los principales involucrados, ¿qué instituciones de control existen? Como ustedes pueden ver allí, nosotros acudimos a INPARQUES, que es la principal institución ambiental que debería controlar este tipo de situaciones, porque definitivamente alguien debe rendir cuentas. Luego también investigar las historias de quienes no están involucrados en estas tramas de poder, de quienes están detrás, quizás esas historias existen, esas historias son a menudo inspiradoras y nos pueden revelar muchísimo del conflicto. Quizás dependiendo del enfoque de la historia, estas historias pueden ser incluidas o no, pero pueden ser punto de partida para otro tipo de trabajos también. Ningún documento, ninguna visita de campo y ninguna entrevista sobran. Una vez que volvemos, por supuesto, al escritorio, a la sala de redacción, es necesario presentar el tema con arte, decidir el género, buscar nuevas narrativas, ver de qué forma contarlo, que capture al lector. Para mí, por ejemplo, en esta historia era muy importante incluir audios que el lector de repente mientras fuera leyendo pudiera escuchar y de alguna manera trasladarse quizás a ese lugar. Y por último, ser paciente. Estos son procesos largos. Esta investigación no fue tan larga, duró 6 meses, pero pudiera ser más larga, por supuesto. Aprender en el camino y seguir documentando siempre, aunque no haya un impacto real. Y con esto del impacto real me refiero a que, por lo menos en el caso de Venezuela, el impacto quizás no se observa en que haya una detención de la actividad o haya un cambio de autoridades en determinados ministerios, pero detrás de estas historias, detrás de esta visibilización, pues también hay sanciones morales, hay documentación que a futuro puede servir para acciones. Y mantener las líneas de investigación. Nosotros en esta zona tenemos, por supuesto, más de 10 años trabajando sobre las industrias de metales y sobre la extracción de minerales, y es algo que pensamos seguir monitoreando, y en caso de que no seamos nosotros, este tipo de investigaciones permiten a otros periodistas jóvenes continuar las líneas de investigación y seguir monitoreando estos problemas. Creo que ya para concluir, me parece muy importante también tratar de entender las relaciones que tienen este tipo de conflictos ambientales como la extracción indiscriminada de minerales con otros poderes, con otros países, entender que esto no es un problema que afecta solamente a esta zona de Venezuela, sino que se conecta con otros países y pues con otros proyectos que quizás están fuera de nuestro alcance. Muchísimas gracias y espero que esto haya sido útil para ustedes.
Gracias, Maria. This was wonderful, very, very interesting. And the fact that you're emphasizing that it's a complex situation because you have indigenous communities who are dependent on this illegal activity and we need alternatives. This is very interesting. So now, first, I would like to tell everyone who's watching this that you can send questions either to the YouTube chat or on comment on Facebook. You can send questions for all our panelists. And I wanted to start by asking something to Amy. Amy, you made a point of saying that you and your colleague, you were reporting using the point of view of, white Americans, right? And there are limitations on that. And that you really wanted to give a voice to them, that they were not portrayed as victims, the indigenous communities. They wanted to. What else would you recommend for people reporting on indigenous communities? How can we sort of not get rid of this lens that we come with, white, but at least be aware of this?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think one of the best things that we can do as journalists or just supporters of readers and listeners and viewers of journalism in general is to look for ways to support building up more capacity, supporting journalists of color, indigenous journalists all over the world so that there are more stories being told by a more diverse group of people. I think that that's crucial. But I also think, there are always going to be people trying to report on communities that are not their own. And I guess one of the things that I tried to do was be really aware of some of the reporting that had already happened. And so that I was maybe aware of some of the paths that had already been trodden and try to not just do something over and over and over, ask the same questions in the same ways. I really made a point, like I said, to ask if I was welcome in this small community before I came. And although I could only stay a week, it was expensive to get there and to stay there. I think it was, crucial to stay at least that long. I wish I could have stayed for an entire summer, but I think, not just coming and going in 24 or 48 hours is important. And then, honestly, I think one of the most important things that we can do as journalists is just learn how to quiet ourselves. And not assume that we know the narrative. So I'm talking about quieting myself, not only verbally, but inside of myself, coming into an interview with the assumption that I don't know. And whatever I think I might know, trying to examine whatever biases I might have had and set them aside, be honest about them and try and set them aside and approach every person just like a blank slate of like, what do you have to teach me? And as much as I can, try to keep my voice, my opinions, my background chatter and really behind and just keep that microphone on the person. And I guess the last thing I would say is just patience. Some people were really actually interested in showing me around and telling their story, but they weren't going to just do it in the first 5 seconds of meeting, and nor should they want to do that. But if, I'm thinking of one person in particular who I met just out wandering around in Shishmaref who kind of just wanted to walk with us for a while, and then said that he wanted to show us some stuff back at his house. And we probably spent, or I think I was just me actually, I think I spent like 2 or 3 hours with him before we got into something that was really super meaty and connected to the story that I was pursuing. And all of that patience and just like showing him that I was willing to make a commitment to understanding a little bit more of the context of his life and not just extract a meaty soundbite and get out of there. I think that ended up meaning a lot to him in terms of what he was willing to share. But I also just want to say, I don't know everything about this. I feel like one of the most important things is to be aware that no matter how much thought I put into it and how much I do try to quiet my own voice, I am still an outsider coming into the situation. And I'm sure I made mistakes, and I'm sure people had to forgive me for things that I would be embarrassed about if I were like watching them now. And I think trying to stay in mind that like this is such a learning process, and to and to not assume that I've ever got it dialed is an important part of being able to do it well.
Thank you, Amy. This is so interesting. I mean, I'm always going to remember you saying we have to silence ourselves, right? I mean, instead of coming with all these preconceptions. This is really interesting. Wahyu, I have a question. You said in the beginning of your presentation that we journalists, we should not be feel hopeless, right? Feel that, it's so hard and everything is so difficult, and is it going to make any difference what we're doing? From your reporting, you mentioned these 2 big reporting projects, the Pangolin and the forest fires. From your reporting, did you see changes? I mean, did anything come out of it? Tiny things or behavior changes or legislation? What happened?
Thank you, Patricia. I think that are the biggest questions we journalists have after we publish our reports. We really hope that our stories can make impact. But I learned over the years that sometimes it takes time to see real impact happening on the ground. For instance, the pangolin story, when we first published it, I think when we first published it at the end of last year, I think the main impact that we saw from that publication was people now know about pangolin. Because before, I think a very small number of Indonesian or maybe people in Southeast Asia even realize that we do have this incredible species, small, beautiful, but have a tremendous benefit to our ecosystem. And they are now threatened by trafficking. I think the fact that we were able to inform our audience that it is a problem is the first step of having bigger impact in terms of changing regulation or even more protection. Fortunately, we were lucky because after we published the pangolin reports, China authorities start clamping down on illegal use of pangolin. They even announced that it will stop using imported pangolin for the traditional medicine. So that's a good thing that happened after the report was published. For the forest fire, it was just published last week, so we have to wait to see.
Thank you. Yeah, this is interesting. I bet, I didn't know that pangolins were very important to keep the soil fertile, for instance, that you mentioned. We don't really know about the role of these animals. Maria, I would like to hear from you. I mean, your story touched in sensitive issues. I mean, you mentioned the military were probably involved in the fuel supply, and also, I mean, there was a lack of the budget was really small for the agency that was supposed to take care of it. What was the reaction of the Venezuelan government to your story? I mean, did you suffer any kind of pressure, or what was the reaction?
No, bueno, el gobierno de Nicolás Maduro pues no reaccionó de ninguna forma. Ese es como alguno de los pendientes de todas estas investigaciones que hacemos en Venezuela. No hay realmente ninguna reacción o ningún impacto hasta ahora. Lo único que ocurrió luego de la publicación del trabajo fue que la Asamblea Nacional, que es el único poder legalmente constituido en Venezuela, hizo una declaración donde declaró, una resolución donde declaró al Parque Nacional Canaima en estado grave desde el punto de vista ambiental. Y pues este tipo de declaratorias, pues los comentarios que hicieron todos los lectores, las organizaciones ambientales que tuvieron acceso al trabajo, como les decía anteriormente, aunque no haya un impacto grande, algún cambio, inversión, por ejemplo, para este tipo de organizaciones de instituciones ambientales o cambio de ministerios, seguimos pensando que es la mejor opción. Hay que seguir documentando, hay que seguir investigando, hay que seguir encendiendo la luz sobre este tipo de conflictos.
And I also meant, we know the Venezuelan government has been more and more it's been intimidating journalists increasingly. I was wondering if you or your colleagues, while doing this kind of environmental investigative reporting, did you suffer any kind of intimidation or pressure from the government?
No, durante la investigación no recibimos ningún tipo de presiones de parte del gobierno. Es importante haber hecho aquel primer viaje que hicimos en principio para tener acceso a estas zonas mineras, por supuesto con autorización de las capitanías indígenas. Finalmente este es un territorio indígena. Y luego de la publicación tampoco sufrimos presiones, pero sí, ciertamente, como lo indicaste, realmente acá hay una política de persecución y de presión contra los periodistas que siguen informando pues con situaciones y condiciones totalmente adversas, pero haciendo un trabajo todavía brillante, develando lo que está detrás, develando la corrupción que hay a gran escala acá en Venezuela.
Thank you, Maria. You said something in your presentation that I thought was very interesting, that the environmental crisis, it plays out incrementally. So it's hard to get attention to it. It's not like you have, like, I don't know, a storm or something that is very sudden and you see the effects. So how do you, what do you think could be done for people to pay more attention to these stories? And even though it's like the effects are going to take a while to be seen.
Yeah, it's that's a great question. The thing about so many environmental stories is it actually, I feel like it's kind of in fits and starts. Like there might be a storm or a forest fire or a crisis that it suddenly blooms into view, and then it goes back to kind of life as normal. And then the tricky thing is, I think, for us as journalists, is when we're reporting on environmental things, is to try to get our audience to think in different timescales, because most of these environmental crises, in the geological time record, all of the last 5,000 years is a blink of an eye, and yet for us humans, if we live 100 years, it's a really long life. And so trying to understand that something that feels slow to us is actually very fast for nature is tricky. And I honestly feel like my approach, and I'm still learning, but one of my approaches is to try to actually use some tools of imaginative storytelling. I make a podcast and a radio show, so We try to use sound and take listeners on some imaginative journeys leading into stories. The Shishmaref story that I talked about here was just one piece of a much larger series about climate change in the Arctic, for instance. And one of the things that we did is we talked to archaeologists in Russia who had been involved in discovering sites in Siberia that were 40,000 years old, where people had been living, for thousands of years in Siberia, 40,000 years ago, and tracing the path, of humanity out of Africa and up into Siberia, and thinking about that journey then across, the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas as a way to kind of pull the listener out of the immediate story and remember that this is part of this much, much longer time horizon, and then drop into okay, so now we're on the Greenland ice sheet and it's melted this much in the last 50 years. And so that so people can kind of start to have a conversation in their own minds between the headlines of the day and this much larger time horizon. But I think it's a challenge because we are, of course, going to think in the time frame of our own little lives. But it's also a challenge that we just simply have to engage with and try to solve, because there is no solving these environmental crises if we stay stuck on 1 or 2 or 5 year timelines. I don't know if that's a great answer, but that's some of how I've tried to approach it.
It's a wonderful answer. We are all trying to figure out how to get people to pay attention. Wahyu, you've done a lot of investigative pieces that are not environmental pieces. Panama Papers, you also participate in investigation, and you were describing in your presentation sort of all the follow the money techniques and how to understand how the criminal networks or organizations work. What is different in doing this kind of story when it's related to the environment, as opposed to, just the police or financial investigation?
Yeah, thank you, Patricia. I think the biggest challenge in using those investigative technique in environmental story is exactly what you just asked Amy just now, is making people realize the impact, because unlike corruption or embezzlement or bribery or financial scandal, where you can immediately see the impact or the victims, in environmental story sometimes the victims are not very easy to identify. In the pangolin story, for instance, it's a species, it's an animal. For many developing countries, for many people who live in developing countries like Indonesia, where poverty is still a problem, income inequality is still a problem, they think, why do I have to care about animal? Why do I have to care about some species going extinct? This is just, the traffickers are just people who wants to make money and wants to make ends meet. So we need to try to really link these environmental stories with people's life and how it will affect them in longer term. And sometimes it's not very easy, I have to admit.
Thank you. Maria, you mentioned that it was the first time anyone was able to approach or enter the mine, right? A journalist. I was wondering if you could tell us, how did you access? I mean, it's not easy to get into the national park and then get into the mine. How did you negotiate access? How long did it take? What was the making of this part of the story?
Era la primera vez que un equipo entraba a esta zona que es el sector oriental del Parque Nacional Canaima. Bueno, justamente para poder tener acceso a esta zona, que todo este eje sur de Venezuela suele ser muy hostil, con presencia de grupos armados. Tuvimos por eso que hacer 2 viajes. En un primer viaje pedimos acceso a las comunidades indígenas, hablamos específicamente con los capitanes de las comunidades, llevamos algunas cartas firmadas explicando exactamente qué era lo que íbamos a realizar. Y los capitanes decidieron trabajar decidieron trabajar con nosotros en el sentido de darnos acceso porque entendían y querían también saber cuál era el impacto real de la minería en sus comunidades. Ellos también necesitaban información sobre cuál era el daño que les podía producir a ellos como comunidad. Tratar no solamente con metales o con mercurio, sino también pues cuál era la capacidad de regeneración de estos suelos, porque estos suelos están totalmente ya sin vegetación y es imposible o muy difícil que se vuelvan a regenerar. Entonces esa fue la forma, tratar de llegar a las propias comunidades y hablar con ellos.
Interesting. So it's not like you just show up there and I mean, because people usually think it's fast, so it's, you know, you have to...
Exactamente, no es tan sencillo y además las comunidades indígenas tienen una cultura que debemos respetar, tienen unos tiempos que no son iguales a los nuestros, entonces nos toca justamente adaptarnos a eso y ser muy respetuosos de sus propias estructuras.
We have a few questions here from the audience. So for Amy, can you talk about how you overcome challenges when accessing information or lack of transparency? And I guess, I mean, now that you have an administration that is skeptical or denies, you know, several of the environmental changes, how do you overcome these difficulties?
I think that, I mean, science is science, and there are thankfully still a lot of really great scientists out there doing fantastic work. Some of them within the administration who are kind of bravely soldiering on despite a lot of oppression from within the administration. So I think trying to keep our gaze on where you know, peer-reviewed, true, you know, fact-checked and fact-checkable science and stories are happening. Honestly, I feel like that for all journalists in the US who have been trying to get information, particularly around environmental issues, out of the Trump administration, I think that we all kind of learned fairly early on that it was a completely different game than had ever been played before. And it was best not to waste a lot of energy trying to get blood from a stone, and try to find other ways to get the truth out. I think, you know, one of the main tools of the administration has been just simply to ignore journalists' comments, like not even provide, you know, a statement to a lot of questions. And so I think that it's, you know, a lot of my work is actually much more on the ground with people, you know, in their ordinary lives. And so you can always go to just people and talk to them. But there have been times I've wanted or tried to get information from within, like, say, the Interior Department, and all you can do is just tell in my case, your listeners, like, we attempted 5 times to have an interview with this person. They said no, so that listeners know that we did our due diligence and they can draw their own conclusions about what that means if we are being totally shut out. But it is not ideal. It is obviously it's far less than ideal, and it's a scary and depressing time to be a journalist in some ways, but it also, I think, has lit the fire under so many journalists to push harder and try harder to get the truth out in this context.
Unfortunately, it sounds familiar to what many of us experienced, right? And many in the audience, I'm sure. Wahyu, there's a question here for you. You mentioned so many journalists and organizations that were involved in the investigations. what are some key challenges or tips for working on sensitive issues in large teams?
Great question. I think we are now increasingly live in a world where journalists have to work in collaboration with each other. The era where lone wolf reporter work alone and not informing their colleagues about their story is long over, and I think it's a good development. It's a good thing that it happened, because as you know.
So internet is not so good. Let's see if Wahyu comes back soon. Otherwise, I'm gonna just start. Okay, he's back. You're back. Great.
Yeah. Where was I? Because the crime and the illegal activity also happen cross border. So we need, as a journalist, also work in cross border. The tips to work together is really trusting each other. The trust is really important, because you rely on your partner in the group to get you the information you need as a group. So you divide the responsibility, you divide the reporting. You need to be able to trust the credibility and the integrity of the journalists that you work with. Building that trust needs time, needs a lot of communication, but once it's there, everything else is just, it will fall to its places.
Wonderful. So do you think you would have been able to conduct all these big projects if you didn't have colleagues or some other journalists collaborating in other countries? Would it be possible?
No, I don't think it will be possible. It's a cross-border story. It's a transnational trafficking network. So it needs a group of journalists working from different countries to tell the story.
Thank you. Now I have a question for Maria, and it's in Spanish, so I'm going to bother you with my portuñol again. So the question from the audience is, ¿cómo apoyar desde el periodismo a las comunidades locales para enfrentar el problema ambiental y defenderse ante los intereses predominantes de otros actores?
Gracias, es una buena pregunta. En primer lugar, pues tratando de formar parte de quienes visibilizan este tipo de problemas. Pero quizás también otra de las opciones sencillas es que tratemos de reforzar lo que son sus propias alternativas locales, apoyando el turismo que realizan en esas comunidades indígenas, la producción que realizan en esas comunidades, no solamente de artesanía, sino también de alimentos, quizás adquiriendo ese tipo de opciones y de iniciativas que ellos promueven, podemos ayudarnos muchísimo a ver esas como sus principales alternativas económicas.
Perfecto. Gracias. We could spend the whole afternoon here talking about those such interesting stories, but our time is coming to an end. I would like to thank you all and to remind you that we still have one webinar of the series. It's going to be on September 29, Local Solutions for Global Change. And one more reminder to all journalists watching us, applications are open for the Gabo Awards, which will recognize works of journalism created or produced in Spanish or Portuguese. Registrations for the competition categories, which are text, image, coverage, and innovation, will be open until October 5th at www.fundaciongabo.org. I really wanted to thank you, Wahyu, Maria, and Amy for your amazing work and for sharing with us such precious insights and tips. Thank you very much, and thank you for our audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
En 1995, Gabriel García Márquez creó en Cartagena la Fundación para el Nuevo Periodismo Iberoamericano. Tras 25 años impulsando el periodismo independiente, ético, innovador y riguroso, ahora somos Fundación Gabo. Somos taller de periodismo. Formamos, inspiramos, incentivamos y conectamos a periodistas de toda Iberoamérica. Somos Premio Gabo. Premiamos el mejor periodismo en español y portugués. Somos Festival Gabo. Celebramos en Medellín el poder de las historias en la mayor fiesta del periodismo y la curiosidad. Somos Centro Gabo. A partir del legado de Gabo, promovemos proyectos de desarrollo social, cultural y educativo. Somos Fundación Gabo. Con camaradería y chéveridad desde el Caribe colombiano, promovemos un mejor periodismo, la creatividad y la memoria de nuestro fundador.
Al proteger al jaguar, apoyamos a que los bosques se mantengan vivos, las especies subsistan y el agua siga corriendo por el continente. Él solo existe si el ecosistema está saludable. En Conexión Jaguar, protegemos, recuperamos y conectamos los hábitats naturales del jaguar en Latinoamérica a través del apoyo a proyectos de conservación y restauración de bosques. Con los proyectos apoyados, mitigamos los efectos del cambio climático al preservar los bosques, que son grandes almacenadores de carbono. Innovamos para que la conservación en manos de las comunidades sea rentable y autosostenible. Al brindar apoyo técnico y económico, para que iniciativas forestales en Latinoamérica comercialicen créditos de carbono de alta calidad para financiar la conservación en el corredor del jaguar. Contribuimos a la protección y mejoramiento de los servicios que nos brinda la naturaleza, la protección de la biodiversidad, la mitigación del cambio climático. Además, apoyamos al empoderamiento y desarrollo de las comunidades rurales. Nos sumamos a las metas globales de sostenibilidad, apoyando al cumplimiento de convenios internacionales y ayudando a la reducción del impacto del cambio climático. Para cambiar el futuro del planeta, necesitamos pasar de los diagnósticos a las acciones. Haz parte de Conexión Jaguar, apoya proyectos de conservación y restauración de bosques o compensa tu huella de carbono con nosotros para que juntos dejemos un legado a las futuras generaciones. Si hay conexión, hay vida.
The Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism and education organization that funds reporting that otherwise wouldn't get covered. We take the work in those projects, use it in our educational engagements to extend the life of the reporting and promote as much conversation as we can.
It is vital to tell underreported stories because we live in a world that's much bigger than us.